In 300, the economic and demographic growth that had been recorded since 1000 came to a halt, and indeed, due to a sharp drop in temperatures, the fields became less fertile. This led to an agricultural crisis, which in turn caused a drastic demographic decline. The crisis of the 300s has long been interpreted in light of the theories of Robert Malthus, an economist of the 1700s, which states that the growth of agricultural resources always follows an arithmetic progression, while demographic growth follows a geometric progression. This leads to an imbalance between food resources and demographic resources, which can be addressed by natural disasters or human measures, such as marrying at an older age when individuals are less fertile. These events restore the balance between human resources and food resources. However, in 300, the worsening climate led to a scarcity of grains, an increase in their prices, and consequently to famines and a subsequent rise in the mortality rate. Another factor that contributed to the demographic decline was the plague epidemic that swept through Europe between 1348 and 1350 and led to the death of 1/3 of the European population, about 25 million people. The plague was brought to the west by Genoese ships that docked in the port of Kaffa, a city on the Black Sea, where the plague was already widespread. The plague manifested with swollen lymph nodes in the neck, groin, and armpits. Other symptoms included fever, vomiting, and black spot. One could die within a few hours to a few days. The plague was an endemic disease, meaning it remained in Europe until 1700. Among the measures adopted to combat the plague, we recall quarantine, which involved periods of 40 days, during which the infected were confined in isolation and subjected to observation. Another measure was the establishment of lazarettos, that is, hospitals with impenetrable walls. It can be said that this is a consequence of the plague. It was mass hysteria. Essentially, a scapegoat was sought, often identified as the Jews. Furthermore, we remember the movement of the flagellants, that is, the religious fanatics who believed that the plague had been sent by God to punish the sins of society. Another sector that entered into crisis was the banking sector, as the 1300s were a century of wars, and very often kings were insolvent towards the banks, such as King Edward III of England towards the Florentine banks of the Peruzzi and Vardi families. The European population reacted to the catastrophe brought about by the economic and demographic crisis. First of all, the collapse in demand for cereals led to a drop in prices. Farmers sought to invest in more profitable crops, such as wool and wine. Additionally, the demographic decline resulted in a labor shortage and an increase in labor wages. Many inherited the wealth of the deceased, which led to an increase in purchasing power. The rise in purchasing power resulted in an increased demand for luxury items, such as precious fabrics. For example, silk workshops developed in Milan. Landowners who could not pay higher wages decided to adopt a new form of contract, sharecropping, where the farmer owed half of the harvest to the owner. The 14th century was also a century of revolts. Many peasants in England and France rebelled against the taxes of the feudal system. For example, in France there was the jacquerie, and in England there was the jacquerie, the revolt against the increase of the poll tax, which was a tax that had to be paid by all men over the age of 15. In Italy there was the revolt of the Ciumpi, where wool workers sought and managed to govern Florence for a brief period until they were violently repressed by the upper bourgeoisie.